3 people were standing in that restaurant kitchen after closing time. 2 women and 1 man who was legally married to one of them, but behaved as though he'd misplaced his wedding vows somewhere between a complimentary wine tasting and a string of terrible decisions on social media. His wife, Rowan Ashford, was standing inside the walk-in cooler doing inventory, counting every box of meat, every bottle of olive oil, while just outside that steel door, her husband, Grant Whitmore, the man whose name was on the restaurant but who couldn't tell thyme from basil unless they were labeled, sat on the prep counter reading aloud a glowing review and taking full credit as if she didn't exist. Beside him, his mistress, Paige Ellison, a food blogger with highlighted hair and manicures that were always more polished than her culinary knowledge, sat snapping photos of a tiramisu Rowan had made at midnight, giggling every time Grant criticized his wife, as though cruelty were some kind of flirtation she hadn't yet read the warning chapter on. But Rowan said nothing, because in her mind, she'd already given Paige exactly 1 winter before the expensive smiles faded, 1 winter before Grant started criticizing the way she laughed in front of suppliers, 1 winter before she discovered that a man who humiliates one woman eventually graduates and humiliates the next. So while Paige sat there looking like she was the luckiest woman in Boston, Rowan quietly thought, "Enjoy it while it lasts. I give you 1 winter." But what Rowan didn't know was that fate wasn't even generous enough to give her 1 week, because right at that moment, the restaurant manager pushed through the kitchen door with a face drained of color and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "Everett Kincaid is sitting out there." And when that name reached her ears, Rowan knew that her marriage, her humiliation, and the future she thought she'd already lost were all about to change forever because of a glass of water. Welcome to our channel. If you enjoy stories like this, hit that like button to show your support, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. Now, let's continue. But to understand why Rowan Ashford was standing in that cold storage room, counting each box of meat as though it were the only way she knew how to survive, we have to go back 11 years, to a 16-year-old girl standing in the kitchen of a house that wasn't hers, holding a borrowed pan, frying the first egg of her life, and forgetting to cut back on the salt. Rowan's mother died when she was 14. One morning, she was still sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee. By afternoon, she was lying in the emergency room, and 3 days later, there was no one sitting at that kitchen table anymore. Her father stayed for 2 more years, but he stayed the way people stay in a room they don't want to enter, meaning with his body and nothing else. Then one morning, when Rowan was 16, she went downstairs to the kitchen and found the house keys lying on the counter beside a cup of coffee, gone cold, and her father was gone. No letter, no message, no address to return to. Just a man who had opened the door, stepped outside, and decided that his final responsibility to his daughter was to leave the keys behind instead of taking them with him. Rowan entered the foster care system that fall. She didn't talk much about that time, not because it was horrifying, but because it was empty. Empty in the way a room can have a bed, a roof, and 3 meals a day, but no one to call her name at night and truly want to hear the answer. She learned to cook because she was hungry. Not hungry in the sense of having no food, but hungry in the sense that no one cooked her a meal that made her feel she deserved to sit down and eat it. So she cooked for herself. She borrowed books from the public library, basic cookbooks with faded illustrations and instructions written in the kind of patient language no one around her ever used. The first scrambled egg she made was a little too salty, a little burned around the edges, and she ate it standing alone at the kitchen counter in the foster home at 6 o'clock in the morning before anyone else woke up. She wrote in a small notebook with a pencil, "Scrambled eggs. First time cooking by myself. A little salty, but edible." That notebook followed her for the next 11 years. It followed her through 3 foster homes, through her first dishwashing job at 17, through a prep cook position at a small Italian restaurant in South Boston when she was 20, and built the foundation of the Whitmore restaurant when she was 21. Grant Whitmore stepped into her life in the spring of the year she was 21. At the time, he was raising money to open his own restaurant, handsome in a way that made people believe before they verified, with a wide smile, an inspiring voice, and a rare ability to make a 21-year-old girl with no family believe that he was the family she had been searching for throughout the past 7 years. They married when she was 22. The Whitmore restaurant opened 6 months later in downtown Boston. On the business license, on the website, in the interview with the local magazine, Grant Whitmore was the owner and head chef. In reality, Rowan was the one who designed the entire menu, hired and trained the staff, negotiated prices with every supplier, from seafood to vegetables, managed the financial books Grant had never once opened, and cooked 70% of the dishes the customers praised. Grant knew how to do two things very well: look good in photographs beside plates of food someone else had cooked, and shake hands with very important guests, with the expression of a man who believed charm was a business skill. And for 5 years, Rowan let him believe that, because she had already lost everything once, and she was willing to endure almost anything so she wouldn't have to lose it again. The erosion didn't come with one blow. It came through 1,000 small cuts, each one so thin that she didn't realize she was bleeding until she looked down and saw that she had become so much smaller than the person she used to be. The first year was gentle. Grant corrected the way she plated a dish in front of a new server, saying, "Let me show you. You aren't used to upscale restaurant standards yet," even though she was the one who had written those standards. She let it pass because everyone sometimes wanted to show off in front of the staff. The second year, it became clearer. One evening, when a business partner came in to eat, Grant introduced her by saying, "This is Rowan. She helps me in the kitchen." Not co-owner, not head chef, not the person who had designed every dish on the menu that partner was holding. Helped. As if she were a talking dishwasher. She let that pass too, because the dining room was full, and she had 14 plates that needed to go out within 6 minutes. By the third year, Grant had begun correcting her in front of guests. She explained to a regular customer that tonight's fish dish used cod instead of salmon because the supplier had delivered late, and Grant stepped over, smiled, and said, "What she means is that we made an intentional change to offer a new experience," then looked at her with the kind of gaze she had learned to read as, "Don't say anything more." So she didn't say anything more, and it went on like that, day after day. Every time she suggested a menu change, Grant said, "Let me think about it," then suggested the exact same idea 2 weeks later, as though it had just come to him in the shower. Every time she successfully negotiated with a supplier, Grant took the thank you call and said, "Yes, I'm very pleased with this agreement." Every time a magazine came to take photographs, Grant stood in the kitchen, wearing a white apron and holding a knife, as though he had just finished chopping an onion, while Rowan stood out of frame behind the kitchen door, cleaning up the real mess. She didn't know exactly when she started looking into the mirror in the staff bathroom and wondering whether she was standing in the restaurant she had built or in someone else's restaurant, but she knew that feeling had been there longer than she wanted to admit. Then, Paige Ellison arrived. 8 months earlier, she walked into the Whitmore with a phone in her hand and the smile of someone about to rate the world on a scale from 1 to 10. She was a food blogger, with around 40,000 followers, specializing in photographing food from a 45-degree angle and writing captions that used the word elevated at least 3 times in every post. She reviewed the restaurant. Grant liked the review. Grant invited her back, and within 2 months, Paige Ellison had gone from food blogger here to review to brand consultant, then to the person sitting at the very important guest table every Friday night, then to the woman Grant kissed in the hallway beside the cold storage room on a Saturday night when he thought Rowan was in the kitchen. Rowan was in the kitchen, but kitchens have ventilation vents, and ventilation vents don't know how to keep secrets. She saw. She always saw. She saw the way Grant started laughing with Paige with the same smile he had stopped giving her after the second year. She saw the way Paige wore the cashmere shawl Rowan had once bought for herself at a thrift shop for $20, wearing it as though it had always belonged to her. She saw everything, and she said nothing, not because she was weak, not because she didn't know she deserved better than that, but because the kitchen opened at 5 o'clock in the morning no matter what had happened the night before, and someone had to get up, turn on the ovens, check the cold storage, call the suppliers, and keep the restaurant she had built from nothing alive for one more day. And that person was always her. And that was why, on the night the restaurant manager pushed open the kitchen door and stepped inside with a face as white as the tablecloths and said that name, Rowan didn't panic. She was in the cold storage room, holding the inventory sheet, her mind calculating whether next week's beef order could be paid before the supplier called with a third reminder. She heard the manager's voice carrying through the steel door, heard the 2 words, Everett Kincaid, and she knew at once that tonight wasn't an ordinary night, because her restaurant manager, a man who had worked in the Boston restaurant industry for 20 years, a man who had handled drunken guests, difficult critics, and one near kitchen fire without changing expression, was standing out there with his hands trembling slightly and his voice sounding as though he had just swallowed a piece of ice. Rowan set the inventory sheet down. She wiped her hands on her apron, stepped out of the cold storage room, and looked through the small window in the kitchen door that led into the dining room. She saw him immediately, not because he was sitting in a prominent spot. On the contrary, he was seated at the darkest corner table in the restaurant, the table Rowan usually saved for guests who wanted to eat alone, because it stayed out of view of the whole room. But even sitting in the dark, that man didn't disappear. He filled the space around him in the way certain people could lower the voice of an entire room without ever speaking loudly. Tall, short, neatly cut black hair, a square jaw, gray eyes, the cold kind of gray. Not sad gray, but the gray of steel that hadn't yet decided whether it would reflect or cut. A faint scar ran along the left side of his jaw, old enough to have blended into the skin, but long enough for anyone who looked closely to know there was a story behind it, and that story wasn't the kind people told at dinner parties. He wore a dark suit, not the kind of suit that tried to impress, but the kind worn by a man who didn't need to impress anyone because everyone in the room already knew who he was before he sat down. In front of him was only a glass of water. No wine, no cocktail. Water, in a clean glass, placed precisely in the center of the coaster, and he had ordered only one dish, the seafood risotto, the dish Rowan cooked herself every night because it required 24 minutes of constant stirring, and no one else in the kitchen had enough patience. But what kept Rowan's eyes fixed on the small window wasn't the glass of water or the food. It was the way he watched. He didn't look at the menu, didn't look at his phone, didn't look around the room for someone to nod hello to. He was watching the servers move between the tables, watching how the tables were arranged, the distance between the chairs, the angle of the knives and forks, watching the light fall across the tabletop and how it changed when a server passed in front of a candle. He observed the restaurant like a man reading a book no one else in the room knew had been opened, reading slowly, reading carefully, and remembering every page. Rowan didn't know who he was then. She didn't know that Everett Kincaid was the owner of Kincaid Holdings, a real estate investment group and high-end restaurant chain stretching along the east coast of America, from Boston to Philadelphia. She didn't know that in business circles, people spoke of him in the same tone they used when talking about the weather, calm on the surface, but always checking whether they needed to carry an umbrella. She didn't know that his influence was rumored to extend into gray areas ordinary people didn't ask about, and smart people knew better than to ask about. She didn't know that he never needed to raise his voice, because he had lawyers, contracts, and something more dangerous than both of those things combined, patience. Rowan would learn all of that later. That night, she knew only one thing. Her restaurant manager's hands were shaking, and anyone who could make a man with 20 years of experience tremble simply by sitting down and ordering a glass of water wasn't an ordinary guest. Everett Kincaid came back the second night. Same table, same glass of water, but this time he ordered something different. The herb-roasted chicken with red wine sauce, the dish Rowan had spent 3 months perfecting until the skin was exactly crisp enough while the meat inside still held the moisture she wanted. He ate slowly. He didn't speak to anyone. He watched. And when he finished eating, he left cash on the table. The exact amount on the bill, plus a 20% tip. Not $1 more, not $1 less, and left without looking back. On the third night, he ordered dessert. The chocolate soufflé Rowan only made by reservation because it required 20 minutes of separate preparation, and no one in the kitchen besides her had enough skill to control the oven temperature properly. He finished eating, set down his spoon, and called the manager to the table. He said only one sentence. "I want to speak with the restaurant owner about an acquisition." The manager almost forgot how to breathe. The next morning, Grant Whitmore received a call from a man named Soren Voss, whose voice was calm and precise, like someone reading a sentence without needing to emphasize a single word, because every word was already heavy enough. Soren explained the offer. Not a full purchase. An investment. $200,000 in exchange for 60% equity, with a structure Soren called a conditional agreement. The money would be held in an escrow account managed by Soren himself, released in stages as the restaurant met specific operational milestones, with a full quality review clause after 60 days. If the restaurant failed to meet standards during the review period, Kincaid Holdings had the full right to withdraw the unreleased capital without needing consent from the party receiving the investment. Grant listened and didn't ask a single question about the review clause. He didn't ask because he hadn't heard it. He had only heard $200,000, and to a man who owed $47,000 to 3 suppliers, was 2 months late on rent, and had a restaurant where every weekend he had to decide whether to pay the electric bill or the food bill first. $200,000 sounded like a bell of salvation, not a warning bell. Grant signed the contract without reading it carefully. He signed because he needed money, and because he believed his charm was enough to handle any clause he didn't understand. This was the second biggest mistake of Grant Whitmore's life. The biggest mistake had been made a long time ago, but he didn't know that yet. The only condition before the first stage of funding was released was a trial dinner. Everett would bring his 12 most important guests to the Whitmore in 3 weeks. The 12 people included 3 senators, 2 investment fund owners, a former federal judge, and a woman named Constance, whom Rowan didn't yet know, but soon would. If the dinner met the standard, the first stage of funding would be released. If not, the deal would end. Grant received the news and reacted the way Grant always reacted when he needed something he couldn't do himself. He found Rowan. His eyes lit up with the kind of light she had learned to recognize after 5 years. The light of a man who didn't see her, but saw what she could do for him. "Rowan, you have to start right away. The menu, the wine, the seating arrangement, everything. This is the biggest opportunity this restaurant has ever had." Paige, who was sitting beside Grant on the high stool at the bar, looked up from her phone and said, "I'll design the tablescape. I have a connection with an amazing florist." Grant nodded at Paige as though she had said something important. Then he looked at Rowan and repeated, "Everything, Rowan. Everything has to be perfect." Rowan didn't look at Grant. She didn't look at Paige. She was staring into the space in front of her and doing the math in her head. 12 guests, 7-course menu, 3 weeks to prepare, a real budget of almost nothing, because every dollar the restaurant had was being used to pay old debts. The seafood supplier in Gloucester might allow delayed payment if she promised a larger order next quarter. The wine supplier would be harder. She would have to make at least 4 phone calls before noon tomorrow. "Fine," she said. 1 word. Then she turned back to the kitchen. Because the 3 weeks started now, and someone had to begin. Rowan began the next morning at 4:30, sitting on the stool in the corner of the kitchen, while the entire restaurant was still dark. With a notebook, a pen, and a cup of cold coffee she forgot to drink because her mind was moving faster than her hand could write. She wrote a list. The list stretched onto the 2nd page, then the 3rd, then the 5th, and every line on that list was something no one else in the restaurant would think about, because no one else in the restaurant knew those things had to be thought about. The 7-course menu had to be redesigned from the beginning, because the current menu wasn't refined enough for a dinner table of 12 people, from a class where the smallest mistake could become a story repeated at 3 other. Partie. She started by researching the guests. The 12 names Soren Voss sent over in a short email with no greeting and no signature, only a list. Rowan looked up each person. Old magazine interviews, profiles on business sites. She called the managers of 2 high-end restaurants in New York, where one of the guests had once hosted a party, asking about dining preferences, allergies, and the small details ordinary people didn't think about. But a good chef had to know before the guest ever sat down. And she found out. One of the 3 senators had a severe allergy to nuts, all kinds of nuts, including nut oil and nut butter. This detail didn't appear in any document Grant had received from Soren. Grant didn't know it, didn't ask about it, and would never have asked, because Grant wasn't the kind of man who asked about food allergies when he was busy rehearsing his speech. Rowan wrote it down. She adjusted the entire menu so that no dish, not even a side sauce, contained any ingredient connected to nuts. Then she called the suppliers. The seafood supplier in Gloucester, the man whose relationship with her had been maintained through honesty and on-time payment for 4 years, agreed to extend payment by 30 days, after Rowan promised that next quarter's order would be 40% larger. It was a promise she didn't yet know how she would keep, but she would find a way, because that was what she always did. Found a way when there was no clear way left. She retrained the service team. The very important guest reception procedure, from how to greet them at the door, to the angle of the water glasses, from the distance to stand while serving, to the exact moment to pour the wine. She personally polished the entire set of silver knives the restaurant had bought from an antique auction 2 years earlier. Every knife, every fork, every spoon, until they reflected the candlelight without a single cloudy mark. And then there was the soufflé. chocolate souffle with a salted caramel center, and edible gold leaf. The dessert, she decided, would be the final note of the dinner, the dish that, once the guests tasted it, would make every negotiation easier, because no one could stay hard with the person who had just fed them something like that. She tested it for the first time on the evening of the third day. The souffle collapsed. She wrote in her notebook, "Oven temperature too high. Baking time 2 minutes too long." The second time, the caramel was bitter. The third time, the center didn't flow properly. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth, each time she noted the temperature, the timing, the ratio of flour to eggs, the ratio of sugar to butter, and each time she adjusted only one variable, so she would know exactly what was wrong. On the 10th try, the souffle was nearly perfect, but the top cracked. On the 12th try, the caramel flowed correctly, but the chocolate was slightly too bitter. On the 15th try, at 11 o'clock at night, on the 12th day of the 3 weeks of preparation, Rowan opened the oven and took out a souffle that, when she cut into it, released the salted caramel center exactly as she had imagined it in her mind from the first day. Slow, golden, both sweet and salty, while the chocolate exterior held its shape without a single crack. She tasted it. She closed her eyes. Then she wrote in her notebook, 15th try. This is it. Throughout those 3 weeks, Paige Ellison contributed by suggesting 3 aesthetic changes to the dinner table, all 3 of which Rowan politely rejected with professional reasons Paige didn't understand, while Margot, the 52-year-old sous chef who had worked with Rowan for 4 years, listened to Paige's suggestions with the face of someone who had just been asked to put ketchup on sushi. While Rowan spent those 3 weeks turning a restaurant struggling to pay its debts into a place worthy of serving the 12 most powerful people she had ever cooked for, Grant Whitmore spent those same 3 weeks preparing in the only way Grant knew how to prepare, which was preparing the surface. He changed through 3 suits. The first was the one he had bought before the restaurant opened, now a little tight across the shoulders. The second he borrowed from a friend with good taste but a different body size. The third he had altered at a tailor shop on Newbury Street, paid for with the money Rowan had planned to use to replace the kitchen hood filter. But she said nothing because she had learned that arguing with Grant about money was like arguing with the tide about when it should rise and fall. You wasted your breath, and the water still came in. Grant rehearsed his welcome speech. He stood in front of the bedroom mirror every night after the restaurant closed, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes fixed on his own reflection, with the satisfaction of a man who believed the image in the mirror would decide whether the dinner succeeded or failed. He practiced saying Mr. Kincaid, with 3 different levels of respect. He practiced how to hold his wine glass while speaking so that he would look both natural and elegant, not realizing that those 2 things couldn't exist at the same time when the person holding the glass was trying that hard. One night, while Rowan was standing in the kitchen at 11 o'clock, testing the reduction sauce for the 4th dish on the menu, a fresh burn on her wrist because she had reached too close to the edge of the pot, her hair pinned into a crooked bun because the heat from the stove had loosened every pin, Grant appeared at the kitchen door. He was still wearing his rehearsal suit, still holding the glass of wine, and his eyes carried the faint confusion of a man who had just realized his speech might not be impressive enough. "What do you think I should open with when I meet Kincaid?" he asked. Rowan didn't look up from the sauce pot. "He hates people who talk too much," she said. The previous restaurant he visited said he left the table early because the owner spoke for too long. Grant was silent for 1 second. "How do you know that?" I asked. 2 words, I asked. Because Rowan had called the managers of 3 restaurants Kincaid had visited before, had asked the questions Grant would never think to ask, had gathered information Grant didn't know needed to be gathered, and she had done all of that in the space between testing the souffle 15 times and negotiating a payment extension with the seafood supplier. Grant considered this information for about 3 seconds. Then he nodded with the kind of nod belonging to a man who had never truly listened to what she said, only filtered out whatever part could serve him, turned around, and went back to the bedroom to keep rehearsing his speech in front of the mirror. Rowan went to bed at midnight. She lay down beside a man who had been sound asleep since 11:30, the man whose speech mattered more than the burn on his wife's wrist. She got up again at 4:30 in the morning. During those 3 weeks of preparation, no one asked Rowan whether she was tired, not because no one saw her, but because everyone had grown so used to her always being there, always working, always standing firm, that they forgot even standing firm required someone to ask whether your legs were aching. When the night of the dinner arrived, the Whitmore looked like a completely different restaurant. not because its structure had changed, or the walls had been repainted, or new tables and chairs had been bought, but because everything that had already been there was now working the way it should have worked from the beginning, if only someone had cared enough to notice every detail. The candlelight on the tables was placed at the exact angle so the glow fell across the guests' faces instead of into their eyes. The tablecloths were pressed so flat that when viewed from the side, not a single crease reflected the candlelight incorrectly. The crystal glasses were polished so perfectly that when wine was poured into them, the red of the wine looked one shade deeper than the same wine would have looked in an ordinary glass. The flowers on the table were low enough for guests sitting across from each other to see one another without having to lean around them, and their fragrance was so light that it could only be noticed when someone bent close, never strong enough to overpower the smell of the food. Everything was perfect. And because true perfection is when people don't notice the effort behind it. None of the 12 guests who walked in that night realized that every detail they were enjoying was the result of 3 weeks in which one woman had worked 20 hours a day with a burn on her wrist and only 3 hours of sleep each night. Everett Kincaid was the last to enter. Rowan stood behind the kitchen door, looking through the small glass window, and she noticed at once that he moved differently from everyone else in the room. The 11 guests before him had entered the way wealthy people entered a place where they had been invited, comfortably, looking around to judge it, then nodding in acceptance, choosing their seats, and waiting to be served. Everett did none of that. He stepped through the door and immediately began observing. Not observing in the sense of looking around, but observing in the sense of listening. He watched the way the servers moved between the tables, watched the distance between their steps, watched how they pulled out chairs for the guests without needing to ask who was sitting where, because they had already been trained on the seating chart. He noted the subtle shifts in the room's ambiance, tracking how the candlelight flickered against the crystal glassware. He watched the way the wine was poured, the angle of the bottle, the speed of the pour, the distance from the mouth of the bottle to the glass. To him, the restaurant operated like a finely tuned machine. He could judge its health simply by listening to the rhythm of the floor, without ever needing to look beneath the surface, needing only to hear the sound of its operation to know which parts were working properly and which parts were straining. And then he sat down, ordered a glass of water, and waited. The dinner began. From inside the kitchen, Rowan directed everything in a low voice, clear and exact in every word. Margot stood beside her, coordinating the hot line, her strong hands steady, her eyes never leaving the oven thermometer. The 4-person kitchen team moved around Rowan like an orchestra around its conductor, each person knowing exactly what they needed to do, at which second, because Rowan had trained with them for the past 10 days, until the rhythm of the kitchen had become instinct instead of command. The appetizer went out on time. The soup went out at the right temperature. The fish went out with the correct presentation, each slice of salmon arranged at precisely the angle Rowan had specified, the sauce drawn across the plate with a small spoon in the curve she had practiced, until her hand remembered it without needing her eyes to check. The first 6 dishes were served continuously, each course spaced exactly 12 minutes apart, enough time for the guests to finish the previous dish without feeling rushed, enough time for the staff to clear the plates and place fresh silverware without anyone at the dinner table noticing the transition. The first 6 dishes were perfect, but the first 6 dishes weren't the test. The test was coming. The incident happened between the 4th course and the 5th, exactly when the rhythm of the kitchen was running at its smoothest, exactly when Rowan had just allowed herself one deep breath because everything was going according to plan, and exactly when she turned her back on the auxiliary oven to check the temperature of the sauce on the main stove. A soft hiss. Not an explosion, not anything loud, just a soft hiss that anyone unfamiliar with a kitchen would have ignored. But Rowan had stood in kitchens for 11 years, and she knew exactly what that hiss meant. The gas valve on the auxiliary oven was leaking. She had discovered this problem 2 months earlier. She had written it in the maintenance log. She had told Grant. She had told him twice. The first time Grant heard it, he said, "I'll call a repairman." The second time Grant heard it, he said, "Don't worry, it still works." It still worked. Until now, until the exact second when the 12 most powerful people the restaurant had ever served were sitting only 1 wall and 1 door away from the kitchen. Smoke began to rise from behind the auxiliary oven. Not fire, not yet, but the smoke smelled of gas. And the smell of gas in a closed kitchen was something Rowan didn't need anyone to explain twice. She acted in 90 seconds. Not 90 seconds of thinking and then acting. 90 seconds of pure action. The kind of action that came from 11 years of standing in a kitchen and knowing that every second of hesitation was one more second for the smoke to spread and one more chance to lose control. From the first second to the fifth, she took 2 steps toward the auxiliary oven, her right hand reaching for the wet towel on the prep counter, her left hand gripping the main gas valve beneath the oven and twisting it shut. From the 6th second to the 15th, she signaled for one kitchen worker to turn on the ventilation fan at the back of the kitchen, not speaking loudly, only using the hand signal she had taught the kitchen team for moments that required absolute silence because the dining room was in service. From the 16th second to the 40th, she opened the auxiliary oven door, pulled out the tray of meat that was only partly roasted, checked its temperature by sight, decided in half a second that the meat could still be saved if it was moved into the main oven immediately, and transferred everything to the main oven, where Margot had already adjusted the temperature because Margot had seen Rowan's eyes and understood without needing to ask. From the 40th second to the 90th, she checked the gas valve again, confirmed that the smoke had stopped, that the ventilation fan was pulling the smell out, and returned to her coordinating position beside the main stove as though nothing had happened. Her voice didn't rise by even 1 note compared with 2 minutes earlier. Her hands didn't shake. Her face was completely calm in the way. Calmness isn't the absence of fear, but the knowledge of exactly what must be done when fear comes, and doing it faster than fear can spread. The kitchen team looked at her. 4 people. No one said anything. But the way they looked at her in that moment changed. The way people look at someone who has just put out a fire not with water, but with pure composure. Margot gave her a small nod, a wordless nod that weighed more than any praise. Out in the dining room, not one guest realized what had just happened. The conversation still flowed. The sound of glasses touching still rang softly. The servers still moved between the tables with the rhythm Rowan had trained into them, and the 5th course still went out on time, at the right temperature, with the right presentation. But one person knew. Everett Kincaid was walking toward the restroom when the incident happened. He was in the hallway connecting the dining room to the restroom area, and he heard it, not the sound of smoke or the gas hiss, because both were too quiet to carry through the wall. He heard the smoke alarm stop. Stop too quickly, too professionally. A smoke alarm in a commercial kitchen is designed to keep ringing until someone deals with the source of the smoke, and when it shuts off in less than 1 minute, it means someone handled the source of the smoke in less than 1 minute, and that was unusual. Everett stopped in the hallway. The kitchen door was open by a few centimeters because a server had just passed through. Through the crack in the door, he saw Rowan. She was standing beside the main oven, a wet towel in her hand, her face completely calm, speaking to the kitchen staff in a low voice that was clear in every word, not raising her tone, not rushing, with the precision of someone who had already handled everything and was now making sure that what had been handled wouldn't happen a second time that night. Everett stood in the hallway for a few seconds. He watched her through the half-open door with an expression Rowan didn't see, because she was focused on the kitchen, not the hallway. That expression wasn't warm, it wasn't cold. It was very still and very focused, the expression of a man who had just registered something he would remember for a very long time. Then he returned to the dinner table, without saying a word. Between the 6th course and dessert, Grant Whitmore stood up. He had been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks, perhaps longer than that. Perhaps his whole life had been one long chain of waiting for moments when he could rise before a room full of people and talk about himself. He held the wine glass in his right hand, at exactly the angle he had practiced in front of the mirror, and began his speech. 12 minutes. 12 minutes that Rowan heard from beginning to end, through the kitchen intercom. Standing beside the prep counter, with her hands still preparing the soufflés, and with every passing minute, she felt something both familiar and exhausting all the way down to her bones. Grant talked about his culinary vision. That vision was Rowan's. She had written it in a small notebook at 4 o'clock in the morning 3 years earlier, when she couldn't sleep and had sat in the dark kitchen sketching out a seasonal menu. Grant talked about the journey of building the Whitmore from nothing. That journey was Rowan's. She was the one who called every supplier, the one who counted every dollar in the budget, the one who stood in the empty kitchen on the first day. The restaurant opened and cooked 12 dishes in a row to make sure everything worked. Grant talked about the philosophy behind every dish, using the exact phrases Rowan had used when explaining to the kitchen staff why she had chosen one ingredient instead of another. But now those phrases were being retold with the pronoun I. I've always believed. I decided. I wanted to bring. As though every recipe had simply appeared inside his head while he was changing suits in front of the mirror. Rowan stood in the kitchen and listened. Her hands didn't stop. She was still weighing flour for the soufflés, still checking the oven temperature. Because dinner didn't stop just because someone was stealing her story in the next room. Margot stood near her. She looked at Rowan with the eyes of someone who had seen this too many times and had still never gotten used to it. Eyes that said, I know and I'm sorry, and if you want, I'll go out there and tell them the truth. Rowan shook her head slightly. Just one small shake of the head. Don't say anything. The speech ended. Polite applause rose from the dining room. The kind of applause people give because manners require it, not because they've been moved. And then, in the silence just after the applause, a woman's voice spoke. Constance. Rowan had never met her, but she had researched her name on the guest list. Constance Webb, 55 years old, owner of a boutique hotel chain along the East Coast. A woman who, from everything Rowan had read, had built her empire from a single hotel in Vermont and knew exactly the difference between the person who worked and the person who talked. Constance didn't announce it to the whole table. She leaned toward Everett, who was seated beside her, and spoke in a voice small enough to be meant only for him, but clear enough for Grant, sitting across from them, to hear every word. The person who cooked the 6 courses tonight has classical French technique. The handling of the sauces, the control of heat, the balance of flavor across a continuous menu. That isn't the skill of someone self-taught over 2 years. That's the skill of someone who has lived in kitchens since they were young. She paused for a beat. And the man who just spoke for 12 minutes can't tell the difference between Julienne and Brunoise. Everett didn't look surprised. He nodded, a very small nod, the kind of nod from someone who had just heard another person confirm what he had known since the first night he sat in the dark corner and ordered water. Then he looked at Grant, looked straight at him, with those cold, piercing gray eyes, and he said, his voice very soft, so soft that the whole table had to lean slightly forward to hear, but soft in the way an order doesn't need to be loud to be obeyed. Bring out the chef. 3 words. Grant looked at Everett. His face passed through 2 emotions very quickly. So quickly that anyone who wasn't paying attention would have missed them. But Rowan paid attention because she had been reading that face for 5 years. The first emotion was fear. The kind of fear belonging to a man who had just realized that the performance had been seen through. The second was calculation. The kind of calculation belonging to a man trying to find a way to turn the situation to his advantage, because that was what Grant always did. Always. Even when the ship was sinking. He would still try to take a photograph where he looked fine on deck. Then he turned toward the kitchen door and called, Rowan. His voice didn't sound like the voice of a man inviting someone. It sounded like the voice of a man who had just been disarmed in front of 12 witnesses and was trying to hide his gasping breath behind a smile. Rowan set the flour measuring spoon down on the prep counter. She looked at Margot. Margot looked back at her with eyes that said, Go. I'll hold the kitchen. Rowan took off her gloves. But she didn't take off her apron because she didn't think of it. Or perhaps because on some level, she had decided that if they wanted to meet the chef, then they would meet the chef exactly as she was, not a version cleaned up and rearranged to be easier to look at. She pushed open the kitchen door and stepped into the dining room. The white apron was still on her body, with a small brown sauce stain near the chest pocket. The burn from 3 weeks earlier on her left wrist had healed, but the skin was still pink and slightly shiny beneath the candlelight, and her hair was pinned crookedly to one side, because 5 hours standing beside an oven in a kitchen without strong enough air conditioning had loosened it. She stood at the head of the dinner table, before the 12 most powerful people this restaurant had ever served, and she looked exactly like someone who had just cooked 7 consecutive courses over 5 hours, because that was the truth, and the truth doesn't need makeup. A moment of silence. The kind of silence in which an entire room is judging someone, and the person being judged knows it but doesn't lower her eyes. Constance looked at her. She looked from the apron to the burn on Rowan's wrist, then at Rowan's hands. Hands that didn't belong to someone who sat in an office, but to someone who had held knives, held pans, and held hot pots every day for more than 10 years. And she looked with the eyes of a woman who had built her own empire from a single hotel, so she knew what working hands looked like. The saffron risotto, Constance said. What technique did you use for the crisp layer underneath? Rowan answered. No hesitation. No introduction. No. Oh, "Thank you for asking." Or, "I was just experimenting." Or any of the things people said when they were trying to seem humble in front of powerful people. She said, "I used the Socrates technique." After the risotto reached the right al dente texture, I left the pan on high heat for another 90 seconds without stirring, allowing the rice in contact with the bottom of the pan to form a natural crisp layer. The pan temperature has to reach 220 degrees Celsius, no higher, because too much heat will burn it instead of crisping it. I used carnaroli rice, not arborio, because carnaroli holds its shape better under high heat in the final stage. Constance looked at her for another second. Then she asked the second question. "The salmon, your beurre blanc has a lighter citrus note than usual. What did you change?" "I replaced part of the white wine with yuzu juice, a 70-30 ratio. It keeps the traditional beurre blanc foundation, but adds a depth that lemon usually can't provide." The third question was about the soup. The fourth was about how she handled timing between courses to keep the serving temperature consistent. The fifth was about the philosophy of the menu. Why 7 courses instead of 5 or 9? Why this order and not another? Rowan answered all 5 questions. Each answer was exact, specific, with numbers, with reasons, and without one unnecessary word. She wasn't speaking to impress. She was speaking because this was what she knew. And she knew it because she had lived inside it, every day for years. And when someone has lived inside something for that long, they don't need to prepare to speak about it. They only need to open their mouth, and the truth flows out on its own. Everett observed the entire conversation. Not secretly, not with a glance. He looked straight at her, openly, in front of the whole table, with a focus Rowan would only understand later as the expression of a man who had just confirmed what he had suspected since the first night, the night he sat in the dark corner, ordered a glass of water and a risotto, and spent the entire dinner not watching the plate, but watching the kitchen door, because he hadn't come there to eat. He had come there to find, and he had found her. Grant sat at the head of the table. He said nothing. He said nothing for the rest of the dinner, because for the first time in 5 years, the room wasn't looking at him. The room was looking at her, and he didn't know what to do when he wasn't the center of attention, because he had never practiced that situation in front of the mirror. Paige left the restaurant before dessert was served. She told someone at the door that she wasn't feeling well. She didn't tell Grant. She didn't tell Rowan either, because Paige wasn't the kind of person who spoke to people she believed only helped in the kitchen, although after Grant's 12-minute speech and Rowan's 5 answers, the entire room knew who truly stood in that kitchen and who had really only stood in front of a mirror. 3 days after the dinner, Grant signed the deal with Kincaid Holdings. Soren Voss sent the contract by email at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Grant signed it at 9:15 without reading the second page, because the first page already had the number he wanted to see. The first stage of funding was $60,000, enough to pay off debts to 3 suppliers and settle 2 months of overdue rent on the space. To Grant, $60,000 sounded like a bell of salvation. He didn't hear the warning bell ringing in the background, the bell saying that the rest of the $200,000 was still sitting in an escrow account he didn't control, that the 60-day quality review began today, and that the only person who could help him survive those 60 days was sitting at the far end of the celebration table, while no one spoke to her. The celebration dinner took place that night. Grant invited 8 friends, the men and women he called his network, and Rowan called the people who drank the restaurant's wine for free once a month. At the table, Grant stood with a wine glass in his hand, his smile wide, his voice higher than usual, because he was drunk on wine and drunk on the feeling of a man who had just been saved by someone else's money. And he made an announcement. He announced that the Whitmore would be rebranded, a new concept, a new menu, a more creative direction. And he would do this with Paige, whom he introduced to the whole table as his creative partner, using the exact title she had given herself on her personal page 2 months earlier. Paige sat beside Grant at the head of the table, smiling at every sentence he spoke, nodding in exactly the right places, and wearing a new dress that Rowan guessed had been bought with the released funds because she recognized the label and knew the price. Throughout the celebration dinner, Grant didn't mention Rowan. Not once. Not thank you to my wife for preparing this dinner. Not Rowan worked very hard. Not a single word. She sat at the end of the table, beside one of Grant's friends she had never met, and that man spent the entire evening talking to the person next to him without looking in her direction even once. She sat there, and she understood. Not with reason, because reason had understood it long ago, but with something deeper, something right in the center of her chest, that she could sit at this table for another 5 years, another 10 years, another 20 years, and she would still be sitting at the end of it, and no one would speak to her, and everything she had built would be told under someone else's name, and she would become a shadow inside the very house she had built. That night, Rowan went back to the small apartment above the restaurant. Grant hadn't come home yet. He was still downstairs drinking with Paige and his group of friends. Rowan sat on the edge of the bed. She didn't cry. She had cried so much during the first 2 years, those long nights when she lay facing the wall and cried without making a sound because she didn't want Grant to hear, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to give him one more thing to complain about in the morning. After those 2 years, the tears slowly ran dry, and the pain settled into something drier and quieter. No longer like pain, but like the absence of a feeling she had stopped expecting, like a room that wasn't cold and wasn't warm, only empty. She stood. She opened the closet. And in the lowest corner, behind old shoes and storage boxes she had never cleared out, was the backpack. The backpack from foster care. Gray canvas, the zipper slightly stuck, one strap frayed. She had never thrown it away. In 5 years of living here, she had cleared away almost everything that belonged to the past, but she had kept the backpack tucked into the corner of the closet, as though somewhere in her subconscious she had always known that one day she would need it again. Today was that day. She put into the backpack one change of clothes, the handwritten recipe notebook she had kept since she was 16, the notebook whose first line was written in pencil. Scrambled eggs, a little salty but edible. Her mother's silver bracelet, the only thing she still had from the woman who had sat drinking coffee at the kitchen table one morning and then never sat there again. She zipped the backpack shut. She didn't write a letter. She didn't leave a note. Before leaving, she went down to the kitchen one last time. 5 o'clock in the morning. The kitchen was dark, the familiar smell of stainless steel, olive oil, and thyme. She placed one thing on the kitchen counter, the restaurant's original recipe notebook. Every dish on the menu. Temperature, timing, ingredient sources, supplier names, personal notes in the margins. All in her handwriting, clear, clean, precise, just like everything she did. She knew no one would read that notebook. Grant wouldn't read it because he never read anything she wrote. Paige wouldn't read it because she didn't know it existed. But when the restaurant collapsed, and Rowan knew it would collapse, that notebook would be sitting there on the kitchen counter as the only proof of who had truly built this place. On her way to the bus station, she stopped at the pawn shop on the corner that she had passed every day for 5 years, but had never once entered. She took off her wedding ring. It wasn't diamond. It was gold-plated silver, the kind of ring Grant had bought when they were both still eating instant noodles, 3 meals a day, and calling it romance. The pawnshop owner looked at the ring, looked at her, and offered a number. $340. $340 for 5 years. That was the pawnshop price of memory, not metal. Rowan took the money, enough to buy a Greyhound bus ticket to Chicago, and pay the first 2 weeks of rent anywhere she could find. She stepped onto the bus at 6:15 in the morning, sat in the window seat near the back, placed the backpack on her lap, and watched Boston slowly fall behind through the dirty glass. She didn't look back toward the restaurant. She didn't need to look back. She remembered every brick, every crack in the wall, every groan of the old oven, and she would carry all of it with her, not because she wanted to keep it, but because those things had become part of her, like the burn on her wrist, healed but still there, reminding her that she had stood close to fire and hadn't run. The collapse of the Whitmore happened both quickly and inevitably, in the way a lesson no one in the restaurant wanted to learn was nevertheless taught by reality for free. During the first week after Rowan left, the kitchen still ran. Margot held everything together with 20 years of experience and loyalty to the kitchen she had come to see as home. But Margot was a chef, not an operator, and the difference began to show as early as the second day, when no one knew the password to the online ingredient ordering system. Rowan had set up that system 3 years earlier, connecting it directly to 4 suppliers, automating orders according to inventory levels, and the password was in her head because she had never needed to write it down, since she was the only one who used it. On the 3rd day, Margot discovered that no one knew which suppliers allowed delayed payment and which suppliers demanded payment before delivery. On the 5th day, the auxiliary oven, the one with the leaking gas valve that Rowan had permanently shut off after the dinner, was somehow turned on again by a new kitchen worker who didn't know its history. On the 7th day, the equipment maintenance schedule Rowan had kept in a separate notebook with color codes for each type of machine vanished into thin air because no one knew where that notebook was. And the truth was that it was sitting right in the second drawer from the top of the work desk in the storage room. But no one opened that drawer because no one knew the work desk in the storage room existed, because no one except Rowan had ever gone into storage to work instead of merely grabbing things. Margot lasted 2 weeks. On the morning of the 15th day, she came in early, folded her apron neatly, placed it on the kitchen counter beside the recipe notebook Rowan had left behind, and walked out. No resignation letter, no explanatory email, no drama. She simply didn't want to cook in a kitchen whose soul had left 2 weeks earlier, and she had enough self-respect not to pretend that everything was fine when everything was very clearly not fine. Paige Ellison filled the empty space by appointing herself to the culinary creative position, a title she invented herself and no one objected to, because no one stayed long enough to object. She removed the 4 best-selling dishes from the menu, including the saffron risotto and the chocolate soufflé, replacing them with dishes she had seen being shared often on social media, without consulting any chef, mostly because the chef hired to replace Margot was a 24-year-old young man fresh out of school, someone with too much enthusiasm, too little experience, and too much fear of Paige to say that what she was asking for didn't make sense in any cookbook. Regular customers began to disappear. Not loudly, not with complaints. They simply didn't come back, because regular customers come to a restaurant for the dishes they love, and when those dishes disappear, they disappear with them. It was simple math Paige didn't understand because she had never had to calculate it. On the 60th day, Soren Voss arrived. He sat in the kitchen for one afternoon, speaking to no one, tasting nothing, only observing. He observed the way the new chef fumbled around the storage room, looking for ingredients without knowing the organizing system. He observed the way the servers stood outside the dining room looking at one another, because no one knew what the new service procedure was after Paige had changed it 3 times in 2 weeks. He observed the way Grant sat in the office, making phone calls in the voice of a man trying to sell something he didn't own. Then Soren went back to the office and wrote a 3-page report. The conclusion was on the final page. 1 sentence only. The restaurant's only valuable asset has left. Recommend liquidation of equity. Everett withdrew the unreleased capital, about $140,000, exactly according to the contract clause Grant had signed without reading the 2nd page. Grant panicked. He tried to read the financial notebook Rowan had left on the kitchen counter, the notebook lying beside Margot's neatly folded apron, and he called the accountant, saying the book was written in code. It wasn't written in code. It was written in clear, clean handwriting, with standard accounting symbols that anyone who had taken a basic accounting course could read. Grant couldn't read it because Grant had never needed to learn how to read it, because for 5 years someone else had read it for him, and that person was now sitting on a bus somewhere between Pennsylvania and Ohio. And then came the cold storage problem. Rowan had been the only person who checked the cold storage thermometer every morning at 5 o'clock, before anyone else arrived. She checked it not because anyone told her to, but because she understood that a cold room running at the wrong temperature was a straight road to disaster, and disaster arrived on a Saturday night when 4 guests suffered mild food poisoning from improperly stored seafood. No one was hospitalized, but the news spread, because bad news always travels faster than good news, and the Whitmore, the restaurant Rowan Ashford had built from nothing and kept standing with her hands, her notebook, and 3 hours of sleep each night, closed on a quiet Monday morning, 4 months after she left, and no one stood at the door to say goodbye, because there was no one left to say it. The Greyhound bus took 18 hours from Boston to Chicago. Rowan sat by the window the entire way, her backpack on her lap, watching America pass by in separate frames through the dirty glass. She didn't sleep, not because she wasn't tired, but because her mind wouldn't turn off. It kept running through lists, calculations, plans, like a machine that had been operating for 11 years and didn't know how to stop just because the person operating it had just lost everything. $340 in her pocket. No one she knew in Chicago. No address to go to. No plan except one single thought she repeated, again and again in her mind for 18 hours on that bus. Start over. She found a studio room on her 2nd day in Chicago, in Pilsen, south of downtown, where colorful murals covered old brick walls and the smell of grilled food drifted out of apartment windows in the evening. The studio cost $650 a month. With a ceiling so low, Rowan had to lower her head slightly when she stood near the window. One single window looking out toward the elevated train tracks, and every time the train passed, the whole room trembled softly as though it were breathing. The landlady's name was Elena, a Mexican woman of about 60 who lived downstairs, broad-shouldered, thick-handed, and baked bread every Saturday morning with flour she ground herself, because she said store-bought flour has no soul. The first time Elena saw Rowan standing at the door with the gray canvas backpack and $300 in cash in her hand, she didn't ask. She didn't ask why a young woman who seemed educated had come to Pilsen alone with one backpack. She didn't ask why Rowan's eyes were dry but her shoulders were heavy. She only said, "Rent is due at the beginning of the month. No dogs. Trash goes out Tuesday and Friday." Then she handed her the key. Rowan began working in the first week. She posted small catering service ads in community groups, keeping the wording simple. Experienced chef available for private dinners and weekly meal prep. Reasonable rates. Contact Rowan. No polished photos. No impressive profile. Just a woman who knew how to cook and needed money. Her first client was a family of 3 in Lincoln Park, who needed meal prep for the whole week because both parents worked 12 hours a day, and their 4-year-old son was in a stage where he would only eat pasta. Rowan cooked 7 dinners for them, each meal packed neatly in containers with labels explaining how to reheat it, and she added 3 different portions of pasta for the child, because she knew that when a 4-year-old said, "only pasta," what he really meant was, "only the kind of pasta I know." So she made 3 kinds to find the right one. The second one was right. The mother called Rowan that night and said, "For the first time in 6 months, my son finished his plate without crying." Then she introduced Rowan to a coworker. The coworker introduced her to a neighbor. The neighbor introduced her to friends. She cooked well. That was the only secret, and it wasn't really a secret at all. It was only the simplest truth. She cooked well because she had cooked every day for 11 years, and 11 years standing in kitchens hadn't given her fame or money, but it had given her something no one could take from her, hands that knew exactly what to do with every ingredient placed in front of them. Within 3 months, she had 15 regular clients. The income was enough to pay rent, food, ingredients, and leave a little extra for her to put into a paper envelope tucked under the mattress, because she hadn't opened a bank account in Chicago yet. Because opening an account meant writing down an address, and writing down an address meant she was here, truly here. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that. At night, after she finished cooking, washed every pot and pan, and wiped clean the counter in the small studio room where she had turned one corner into a working kitchen, she read books about restaurant management, books about food supply chains, books about small business law in Illinois. She read in bed, under the only desk lamp, while the train passed outside the window and shook the whole room. And she was doing what she had always done since she was a 16-year-old girl in a foster kitchen, educating herself in the spaces life left behind. The space between 2 catering orders. The space between midnight and 4 o'clock in the morning. The space between the person she had once been and the person she was trying to become. She didn't contact anyone from Boston. She didn't call Margot, though she wanted to. She didn't look up news about the Whitmore, though she was curious. She didn't write to anyone, because she wasn't ready to be seen. Not ready for someone from her old life to look at her and see a 27-year-old woman living in a $650 studio in Pilsen with 1 backpack and 15 catering clients. She needed more time. Time to turn emptiness into fullness. Time to remember that she had once fed herself before Grant Whitmore entered her life, and she could feed herself after he walked out of it. The 4th month in Chicago was the month Rowan almost stopped. A new client contacted her through a referral from one of her 15 regular clients. A woman living in Gold Coast, the wealthiest neighborhood in Chicago, who needed Rowan to cook a birthday dinner for her husband. 15 guests, a 4-course menu, unlimited budget. Rowan accepted the job because an unlimited budget meant she could buy the best ingredients, and the best ingredients meant she could cook properly instead of cooking within what someone could afford. And for a chef, that was a rare luxury. The problem began when she arrived at the client's penthouse apartment and saw the kitchen. It was beautiful. White marble counters, lacquered cabinets, a double induction cooktop, and an oven smaller than the one in her studio room in Pilsen. The kind of decorative oven an interior designer chose because it looked beautiful, not because anyone would actually bake something for 15 people inside it. Rowan looked at the oven and calculated in her head, 4 courses, 15 people. This oven could only hold 2 trays at a time instead of 4. She would have to bake in batches, and baking in batches meant at least one dish would be late if her timing wasn't perfect. She was almost perfect. Almost. The third dish, herb-roasted chicken, was 8 minutes late. 8 minutes. In the world of professional restaurants, 8 minutes late was acceptable when cooking for 15 people in an oven meant for 4. In the world of the Gold Coast woman, 8 minutes late was a crime. Rowan was in the kitchen, cutting garnish for the final plate, when she heard the voice carrying from the dining room through the open door. The client's voice, clear, loud enough for the 15 people at the table to hear, and loud enough for Rowan in the kitchen to hear every word. I hired a professional service, not someone cooking in a home kitchen. 8 minutes late. I'm not paying for amateur work. Rowan stood in someone else's kitchen, wearing an apron, a knife in her hand, and listened to people talk about her in the next room. And in that moment, she felt something she had thought she had left behind in Boston, rising from somewhere deep in her chest. Something so familiar that she recognized it immediately. The feeling of standing in a kitchen, invisible, criticized, by someone who didn't know who she was and didn't care enough to ask. She finished cooking. She cleaned up. She took the money. She returned to her studio room in Pilsen at 11 o'clock at night, climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, opened the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark. The train passed outside the window and shook the whole room. She sat there for a very long time. She looked at the foster care backpack in the corner, the gray canvas backpack with the stuck zipper that she had carried from Boston to here, and she thought that she could stop. She could apply for a dishwashing job at some restaurant, the kind of restaurant where no one knew her name and no one expected anything from her except clean plates. She could stop dreaming about having her own restaurant. She could stop reading books about business management at 1 o'clock in the morning as though she were preparing for a future that might never come. She could accept a smaller life, a quieter life, one where no one criticized her and no one praised her either, a life that fit the exact size of the $650 studio room with its low ceiling and one single window. Then she saw the notebook, the recipe notebook. It was lying on the small table beside the bed, next to a glass of water, and the book about food supply chains she hadn't finished reading. She reached for it. She opened the first page, and there, in the handwriting of a 16-year-old girl, written in pencil and slightly faded after 11 years, was the line she had read many times, but had never needed to read as much as she did tonight. Scrambled eggs. First time cooking by myself. A little salty, but edible. She remembered that girl. 16 years old. Standing in the foster home kitchen at 6 o'clock in the morning before anyone else woke up. Hands trembling, holding a pan for the first time, frying eggs, adding too much salt, and eating them standing alone at the kitchen counter, because there was no dining table where she felt allowed to sit. That girl didn't give up, not because she was brave, not because she had a plan, but because there was no one else to cook for her, and if she stopped, she would go hungry, and hunger wasn't an option, so cooking wasn't an option either. It was survival, and survival doesn't need courage. It only needs you not to stop. Rowan closed the notebook. She placed it back on the table. She turned off the light. She didn't know whether she would be able to sleep, but she knew she would get up at 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, and she did. At 5 o'clock in the morning, she stood in the small kitchen of her studio, turned on the single-burner electric stove, and fried eggs. Not because that was the only breakfast she could make, but because that was the first meal the 16-year-old girl had ever cooked, and if that girl could begin with an egg that was a little too salty, then this 28-year-old woman could begin again with a fried egg in a studio room in Pilsen. She ate standing alone at the kitchen counter, just like the first time, but this time her hands didn't tremble. Then she washed the pan, wiped the counter, sat down at the table, and called 3 new clients. 4 months after the night of the fried egg, on a Tuesday morning in November, 8 months after Rowan left Boston, someone knocked on the door of her studio at 10 o'clock in the morning. Rowan was sitting at the small table beside the window, writing down the ingredient list for 3 catering orders that week, and she wasn't expecting anyone, because she never expected anyone, because no one knew she was here except her 15 catering clients, her landlady Elena, and a vegetable seller at the Pilsen Farmers Market from whom she bought produce every Saturday morning. She opened the door. The man standing in front of her was tall and lean, his hair prematurely silver, his face carrying no expression she could read, wearing a precisely tailored gray suit, the kind of suit people didn't wear in Pilsen on a Tuesday morning unless they had come from somewhere very different. He looked at her. She looked at him. The apartment hallway was silent except for the sound of the train passing outside the window at the end of the hall. "Rowan Ashford?" he said. "Not Whitmore. Ashford. Her mother's last name. The name she had gone back to using the day she stepped onto the Greyhound bus, because she had decided that if she was going to begin again, she would begin with the name her mother had given her, not the name Grant Whitmore had taken. "I'm Soren Voss," he said. "I represent Kincaid Holdings." Rowan didn't react. Or more accurately, she reacted by not reacting, which she had learned after years of standing in kitchens, because sometimes the best way to judge a situation was to stand still and let the situation explain itself. Soren explained. Briefly. Precisely. Without preamble. He said Everett Kincaid had asked him to find Rowan after withdrawing his capital from the Whitmore, giving no reason, only saying to find her. It took Soren 3 months. 3 months of tracing old restaurant personnel records that Grant had never locked, because Grant didn't know where the personnel records were kept. Through supplier lists Rowan had once contacted, because the suppliers remembered her name since she was the only person at the Whitmore who had ever paid invoices on time. Through a food industry manager in Boston who remembered her name, remembered her skill, and knew she had gone west because he had once given her a few contacts in Chicago that she never used, but he hadn't forgotten. Soren explained the position. Director of Culinary Operations for a chain of 3 high-end restaurants under Kincaid Holdings in New York. Quality control, finance, and culinary staffing for the entire group. Salary of $2,800 a week. An apartment in the company's building. Reporting directly to Everett Kincaid. Rowan looked at him from the doorway of the studio. The room with a ceiling so low Soren would have to lower his head if he stepped inside. The room that held her entire life from the past 8 months, from the gray canvas backpack in the corner to the recipe notebook on the table, to the smell of garlic and olive oil that she suspected had soaked into the walls. "He sent a lawyer to recruit a chef?" she said. Soren's expression didn't change. Something Rowan would later learn was because Soren never changed expression, since he had only one expression, and it worked well for every situation. "He sent me to recruit the person. He watched cook 6 courses for 12 people while handling a gas leak without a single guest noticing." Silence. 10 seconds. The train passed outside the window, shaking the whole hallway. Rowan looked at Soren. Soren looked at Rowan. No one moved. "Come in," Rowan said. "I just made coffee." She made Soren a cup of coffee in the small pot on the single-burner electric stove. A cup of coffee Soren would later tell Everett was the best coffee he had ever had. Something Rowan would never know because Soren wasn't the kind of man who gave compliments directly. She sat across from him at the small table she used for writing ingredient lists, and she asked one question. "Who do I report to?" "Mr. Kincaid. Directly." Rowan took a sip of coffee. She didn't sit and think for 2 days. She didn't ask for time to consider it. She had spent the past 4 months rising from the night she had almost given up, cooking eggs every morning, calling new clients, reading books at 1 o'clock in the morning, and she knew she had passed the point of hesitation a long time ago, because hesitation was a luxury for people who had time, and she didn't have time. She only had her hands, a notebook, and the determination she had carried since she was a 16-year-old girl in a foster home kitchen. "All right," she said. Rowan arrived in New York on a Monday in November, carrying the gray canvas backpack, the recipe notebook, and her mother's silver bracelet. She brought nothing else because she had nothing else, and she had learned that starting over didn't require many things, only knowing exactly where you were going and why. Kincaid Holdings headquarters stood on a quiet street on the Upper East Side, a 4-story brownstone that looked from the outside like an old family home with stone steps and a dark wooden door, but inside operated with the precision of a machine in which every gear knew its place. Soren met her at the door and took her to a small office on the 2nd floor with a desk, a computer, and a window overlooking the courtyard. He explained the structure. 3 restaurants, Tribeca, Midtown, Brooklyn, each with its own manager, its own head chef, its own staff. Rowan's job was to coordinate quality and finance for all 3. "Your desk is here," Soren said. "Financial records are in the left cabinet. System passwords are written on paper in the envelope on the desk." Rowan looked at the desk. She looked at the window. She looked at the filing cabinet. Then she said, "Thank you. I'll be back here at 4 o'clock this afternoon." Soren looked at her with the only expression he had, the expression of no expression. But this time, there was something at the corner of his eyes that, if he had been anyone else, might have been called surprise. "Where are you going?" "To see the restaurants." Rowan didn't sit at a desk on her first day. She didn't open the financial files. She didn't read the management reports. She took her coat, slipped the small notebook into her pocket, and walked out the door. The first restaurant, Tribeca. She arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning, the prep hour before lunch service opened. She didn't introduce herself as Director of Culinary Operations. She told the manager she was from the Kincaid office for an inspection, and she went straight into the kitchen. She tasted the stock simmering on the main stove. She opened the refrigerator and read the expiration labels on every container of ingredients, every bag of vegetables, every tray of meat. She watched the way the head chef prepared mise en place and counted the number of ingredient containers on the prep counter against the number of dishes on the lunch menu. She opened the freezer and checked the thermometer. She didn't ask many questions. She observed, because a kitchen told stories more clearly than any report, and she knew how to listen. The second restaurant, Midtown. She arrived at 11:30. She stood at the bar for 15 minutes, watching the bartender make cocktails. She counted the number of servers against the number of tables in the dining room. She went into the kitchen, opened the spice cabinet, smelled every jar, and checked the opening dates she knew should be written on every spice jar according to food safety standards. The third restaurant, Brooklyn. She arrived at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, in the middle of lunch service. She sat at a corner table, ordered a dish, ate, and observed how the servers moved, how the food was brought out, the time from ordering to serving. Then she went into the kitchen. She spent exactly 1 hour in each restaurant. No more. 1 hour was enough when the observer knew what she was looking for. She returned to the office at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, sat down at the desk Soren had prepared, and wrote 3 pages. Not about finance, about quality. Page 1. The Tribeca restaurant was serving frozen salmon and listing it on the menu as fresh salmon. She knew because she had seen the texture of the fish when she opened the refrigerator. Fresh salmon had glossy flesh and bounced back when pressed lightly, while thawed frozen salmon looked dull and softened at the edges, and the fish in the Tribeca refrigerator was soft at the edges. Page 2. The Midtown restaurant had a bartender making old fashions with the wrong ratio, too much syrup, too little bitters, and he stirred 7 turns instead of 20, something Rowan noticed simply by standing at the bar for 15 minutes, because she had spent 2 years at the Whitmore teaching herself how to make cocktails, so the restaurant wouldn't have to hire another bartender it couldn't afford to pay. Page 3. The Brooklyn restaurant had a head chef using frying oil that was 3 days past its change date. She knew because she smelled old oil when she walked into the kitchen, and when she checked the oil container, the replacement date on the label was 3 days behind schedule. And expired frying oil didn't only affect flavor, it affected customer health, which the Brooklyn head chef either didn't know or didn't care about, and both were unacceptable. Rowan placed the report on the desk at 5 o'clock in the afternoon and went back to the small apartment in the company building that Soren had arranged for her. She didn't know Everett read the report that night. She didn't know he read those 3 pages twice. She didn't know he sat still for a very long time after finishing, because he had just realized that in one day, a woman he had spent 3 months looking for had seen things that 3 managers, with a combined salary of $280,000 a year, hadn't seen in 6 months. And she had seen them not from a desk, but from inside the kitchen, where truth had nowhere to hide. The next day, Everett came to the office earlier than usual. Rowan had already been there since 7 o'clock in the morning, because she always arrived early, because arriving early was the habit of someone who had spent 11 years opening kitchens before anyone else woke up. Everett walked in. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without asking permission, because he was the kind of man who didn't ask permission before sitting in a chair inside his own building. But he didn't sit with an air of power either. He sat with the concentration of a man about to ask a question whose answer he truly wanted to hear. "I hired 3 managers," he said, "with a combined salary of $280,000 a year to run those 3 restaurants. You arrived for 1 day and found things they hadn't found in 6 months." He didn't say it like a compliment. He said it like a man, stating a fact he needed to understand. Rowan looked at him. His gray eyes looked straight at her. Not cold, not warm, only intensely focused. The kind of focus she had first seen when he sat in the dark corner of the Whitmore, ordered water, and watched the servers move. "They manage from a desk," Rowan said. "I manage from the kitchen." She paused for a beat. Kitchens don't know how to lie. In the weeks that followed, Rowan did what she always did. She went deep into the kitchen and let the kitchen tell her the truth. The problem at Tribeca wasn't only that frozen salmon was being listed as fresh on the menu. The larger problem lay with the restaurant manager, a 42-year-old man named Harrison, who had managed Tribeca since the restaurant opened and had spent that time building a compact and very effective little system for stealing money without anyone noticing. Rowan discovered it because she didn't look at the numbers on the invoices. She looked at the meat. More specifically, she looked at the Wagyu beef the restaurant ordered every week. The order listed 12 kilograms of Wagyu each week at $200 per kilogram. But when Rowan stood in the Tribeca kitchen on a Wednesday morning and counted the portions of Wagyu prepared for dinner service, she counted enough for about 7 kilograms, not 12. 5 kilograms vanished every week, multiplied by 4 weeks a month, multiplied by $200 per kilogram, $6,000 a month, over 6 months, $36,000. Harrison had inflated the order, received invoices for 12 kilograms, actually ordered only 7, and pocketed the difference. Simple, efficient, and completely invisible to 3 desk-bound managers reading financial reports while never once counting the meat in the refrigerator. Rowan presented it to Everett on a Thursday afternoon, sitting across from him at the desk, the files spread out between them. She didn't only bring evidence, she brought a plan. "A lawsuit will attract media attention," she said. "If the media writes about fraud inside a Kincaid Holdings restaurant, the damage will be greater than $30,000. Instead, use the evidence as leverage. Force Harrison to return $30,000 and sign a non-compete agreement. He'll sign because the other option is having the file sent to the prosecutor." Everett looked at her. He didn't look at the file. He looked at her. "You just gave me a complete solution instead of only a problem," he said. "Pointing out a problem without a solution is complaining," Rowan said. "I'm not paid to complain." He looked at her for another second. Then he nodded, the kind of nod she had begun to recognize as his way of saying good, without needing to use the word. Harrison was fired the next day. He returned $30,000 and signed the agreement within a week. No news in the papers. No scandal. Only a problem handled cleanly by someone who knew that sometimes the strongest way to deal with something was not to make noise. In the weeks that followed, the formal distance between the two of them began to thin in the way distance always thins when two people are truly useful to each other. Not because anyone intended it, but because work pulled them to the same table for too many hours. And when two people sit at the same table for too many hours, formality doesn't last as long as honesty. One late night in the middle of December, the two of them were sitting in the office, Everett reviewing the wine contract for the Midtown restaurant, Rowan writing a staffing restructuring plan for Brooklyn, almost 10 o'clock at night. The building was silent, except for the sound of rain outside and the turning of paper. Rowan looked up. "Have you eaten?" Everett didn't look up from the contract. "No, I haven't either." She stood. She went down to the ground floor kitchen of the building, the kitchen no one used except to heat up takeout, and opened the cabinets. Garlic, olive oil, a box of dry spaghetti, dried chili, and in the corner of the refrigerator, a piece of Parmesan someone had forgotten who knew how long ago. In 25 minutes, she cooked pasta aglio e olio, the simplest dish in Italian cuisine, needing only 5 ingredients, but also the dish every chef knew was the hardest, because when there were only 5 ingredients, there was nowhere to hide a mistake. She brought 2 plates up to the office, set them on the desk, between the contracts and papers. They ate. Neither of them said anything throughout the meal. Everett ate slowly, the kind of slow that came from someone paying attention to every flavor, not the slow of someone being polite. When he finished, he set his fork down, looked at the empty plate, then looked at her. "This is the best meal I've had this year," he said. "And I own 3 restaurants." "You own 3 buildings with kitchens," Rowan said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. Then he did something Rowan would remember for a very long time, longer than any financial number or any report. He told her about his mother. He didn't begin with, "I want to tell you something," or, "There's a story." He simply started speaking, as though the pasta had opened a door he hadn't known he was standing in front of. His mother's name was Margaret. She ran his father's entire business network for 20 years. Everything. Finance, staffing, partners, contracts. She was the one who woke at 4 o'clock in the morning and went to sleep at midnight, and between those 2 points, she kept an empire standing, while her husband, the man the press called a business genius, appeared in magazines, spoke at conferences, and accepted every compliment. He didn't know the password to his own email, Everett said, his voice very still, the kind of stillness belonging to someone who had told this story inside his own head thousands of times but had never spoken it aloud. My mother knew the passwords to 43 business accounts. His mother died of illness when he was 19. He didn't say what illness, and Rowan didn't ask, because she knew that sometimes the detail mattered less than the emptiness it left behind. His father went bankrupt within 18 months afterward, not because the market was bad, not because the competition was strong, but because the only person who truly knew how to operate everything was no longer there, and no one, including her husband, had ever realized how important she was until she was gone. So when I sat in your husband's restaurant 3 nights in a row, Everett said, I wasn't evaluating the restaurant. I was looking for who was actually running it, because I had seen that pattern before. Silence. Rain outside the window. The warm yellow desk lamp. 2 empty plates of pasta on the table between piles of documents. Rowan looked at him, and for the first time since she had stepped into this building, she didn't see the owner, didn't see the boss, didn't see the investor. She saw a son who had lost his mother at 19 and had spent the rest of his life trying to make sure no one became invisible the way his mother had. And she understood, not with reason but with something deeper, that he hadn't searched for her because she was good. He had searched for her because he had seen her, truly seen her, from the first night through a glass of water. And in the world where he lived, seeing a person no one else saw was the way he kept his promise to his mother. March arrived and brought with it a voice Rowan hadn't expected to hear again. She was sitting in the Tribeca restaurant kitchen at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, reviewing the new spring menu, when her phone vibrated. Unknown number. Rhode Island area code. She answered because she answered every call from an unknown number, a habit from her catering days in Chicago, when every unknown call might have been a new client. Rowan. Grant's voice. She recognized it instantly, not because his voice was special, but because she had heard that voice say her name for 5 years, usually when he needed something, and this time was no exception. He had gotten her number through the seafood supplier in Gloucester, the man Rowan had maintained a relationship with for 4 years through honesty and on-time payment. Grant had called the supplier, said he needed to contact his ex-wife about tax documents, and the supplier gave him the number because he had no reason to be suspicious. The call lasted 4 minutes. Grant spoke quickly, his voice sounding more tired than she remembered, stripped of the inspiring quality he had once used to fill every room. The Whitmore had closed. Paige had left, following a gym chain owner in Miami, whom she had met on social media. Grant was working as a night shift manager at a casual restaurant chain in Rhode Island, the kind of place where the menu was pre-printed and laminated, the kind of place Grant, 5 years earlier, would never have stepped into. He said he had found a new investor. He said he was planning to open a new restaurant. He said he needed only one thing, for Rowan to come back and run it. You only need to come back, he said. I'll handle the rest. Rowan was silent for a very long time, long enough for Grant to begin breathing heavier on the other end of the line. Because Rowan's silence wasn't the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of someone who had finished thinking long ago. Grant, she said, do you know what the first thing I cooked for myself after leaving your restaurant was? No. Fried eggs. In a studio room in Chicago, on a single-burner electric stove, at 5 o'clock in the morning, alone. Silence. And it was the best meal I'd ever eaten, because for the first time in 5 years, I cooked for myself. Not for guests, not for critics, not for you, for me. A longer silence. I'm not coming back, Grant, not because I hate you, but because I finally know what cooking tastes like when I cook for someone who values it. She hung up. Her hand didn't shake. She set the phone down on the stainless steel counter, looked at it for 1 second, then turned back to the spring menu. April brought a different kind of trouble. Harrison, the former Tribeca manager who had been fired and forced to return $30,000, sent Rowan a message. It was long, written in the voice of someone angry and not smart enough to hide it. He said he had looked into her. He knew she had grown up in foster care. He knew she had no family. And he threatened to send that information to the media, along with a fabricated story that she had falsified records to get hired at Kincaid Holdings. Rowan read the message. She read it a second time. Then she took a screenshot, saved it, and went back to work. She didn't panic because she had been used to being threatened in different ways all her life. Only now she knew the difference between a real threat and the barking of a man who had lost. Soren discovered the message through Kincaid Holdings security, the monitoring system Soren maintained as part of his job because, in the world Everett operated in, threats against senior personnel were something to know about before they became a problem. Soren told Everett. Everett didn't call Harrison. He didn't go see Harrison. He didn't do any of the things movies like to suggest powerful men would do. He let Soren handle it the way Soren always handled things, with paperwork. 3 law firms sent 3 separate letters to Harrison within 48 hours. Each letter attached with the fraud evidence Rowan had gathered, along with a warning that if he contacted Rowan or any media outlet, he would face a civil lawsuit demanding $2 million in damages, and the fraud file would be sent to the federal prosecutor. Harrison disappeared. Not literally disappeared. He simply stopped contacting, stopped threatening, and stopped existing in any conversation at Kincaid Holdings, because he had understood that barking in the wrong direction turned the bark into evidence. That evening, Rowan and Everett sat in the office. Outside, the storm continued to press against the glass, while the steady glow of the office lamp kept the cold at bay. Everett said, "I handled it. I know. Thank you." Then she stopped. She looked at him. "But you need to know one thing. My past isn't something I'm ashamed of. It's something I survived. If anyone wants to use it to bring me down, they'll have to explain why a woman with no family is running 3 restaurants and a charity program while they're being sued by 3 law firms." Everett looked at her, silent for a very long time, longer than any silence that had ever passed between them before. Then he said, his voice lower than the one he usually used in the office, lower than the one he used in meetings, so low that if anyone else had been in the room, they wouldn't have heard it. But there were only 2 people there, and both heard very clearly. "I didn't protect you because you needed protection. I protected you because I couldn't stand the thought of someone trying to make you small again. You were small enough already. In that house, in that kitchen, enough." He used the intimate you, not the formal you, the intimate you, for the first time, and Rowan heard it, and she didn't correct him. And they both knew, without needing to say it aloud, that the thing sitting between them at the desk, among the papers and 2 cups of cold coffee, was no longer a working relationship. It wasn't love in the storybook sense, not lightning strikes or roses. It was something slower and truer, something built from late nights of work and plates of pasta and plain-spoken truths and silences no one needed to fill. It was 2 people who had seen each other in the exact place where the rest of the world had looked past them, and had decided not to look past. May arrived without Rowan realizing it, because she was busy living, truly busy living in a way she had never lived before. Busy with work she was good at, and recognized for being good at. Busy with long days in the kitchens of 3 restaurants, and late nights in the office beside a man she had stopped calling Mr. Kincaid in her mind since the night of the pasta, and had begun calling by his name, Everett, though she had never once said that name aloud in front of him, because she wasn't ready for the sound of it in the space between them. The Tribeca restaurant, at 6 o'clock in the morning, on a day in the middle of May. Rowan arrived earlier than usual because she was testing a new recipe for the summer menu, a fish dish with passion fruit sauce that she had been imagining in her mind for 2 weeks, but still hadn't found the right balance between sour and sweet. The kitchen was dark. Only the prep counter light was on, creating a warm yellow pool of light over the stainless steel surface, while the rest of the kitchen remained sunk in the darkness of early day. She stood at the prep counter, a wooden spoon in her hand, tasting the sauce for the 3rd time, her eyes closed so she could focus on flavor instead of image, because she believed good cooking began with listening through the tongue, not seeing through the eyes. She didn't know how long Everett had been standing in the kitchen doorway. She hadn't heard his footsteps because he moved very lightly, always very lightly, something she had noticed months ago, that for a man over 6 feet 2 inches tall, he had the strange ability to enter a room without anyone knowing until he wanted them to know. She turned and saw him. She startled slightly. Not fear, only surprise. The kind of surprise you feel when you're in a space you thought belonged only to you, and realize that the person you have thought about most over the past several months is standing 3 meters away. "What are you doing here at 6 o'clock in the morning?" she asked. "I couldn't sleep." "So you came to the restaurant?" "I came to you." 2 words. "I came to you. Not to the restaurant. Not to the office. To you." Rowan set the wooden spoon down on the stainless steel counter. The soft sound of the spoon touching metal echoed through the dark kitchen. "You once said kitchens don't know how to lie," Everett said. He stood in the doorway, still not stepping inside, as though he was asking permission by waiting. I think that's why I want to say this here. Not at some party. Not in some expensive restaurant with candles and music and 100 people watching. He paused. Here, in the kitchen, where you are most yourself. He stepped inside, slowly, crossing the darkness between the door and the prep counter, entering the warm, yellow pool of light from the counter lamp, and standing beside the stainless steel surface, where the scent of passion fruit sauce still lingered faintly. He looked at her. Gray eyes, but not cold. Not the gray of steel anymore. The gray of the sky before dawn, when the dark has passed but the light hasn't fully arrived. The kind of gray where anything is possible. I don't want to propose to you in front of a crowd, he said, because you're not someone who needs an audience to know your worth. You knew your worth before anyone saw you. Before I saw you. You knew it from your first fried egg at 16. You knew it from 15 tries at the soufflé. You knew it from the night you stood up in Chicago and called 3 new clients instead of giving up. He stopped. I only want to be the person standing beside you while you know it. Rowan looked at him. Her eyes stung. Maybe because of the onions she had cut 10 minutes before he arrived. Onions she had chopped for the morning prep, and onions left their mark on the eyes longer than people thought. Or maybe for another reason. She wasn't sure. She didn't need to be sure. Is this the part where you ask? She said. This is the part where I say I want to spend the rest of my life eating everything you cook and never daring to complain. She laughed. And that laugh was different from every laugh she had ever laughed before. Not the polite laugh in front of guests. Not the small laugh she used to soften the air when Grant criticized her in front of the staff. Not the laugh she had practiced for 5 years to look normal when nothing inside her was normal at all. This was a laugh with no control, no calculation, serving no one but herself. The laugh of someone who had just heard something she hadn't known. She had been waiting to hear until she heard it. Yes, she said. One word. The same word she had said when Soren asked whether she would take the job. The same word she had said when Grant told her to prepare the dinner. But this time, the word yes didn't carry resignation or calculation or tired acceptance. This time, it carried choice. The free, whole choice of a woman who had rebuilt herself from a backpack and a fried egg and was now standing in the kitchen where she belonged, saying yes to the person she wanted to say yes to, not the person she had to. No one applauded. There was no audience, no candles, no music. Only 2 people in a kitchen at 6 o'clock in the morning. The smell of butter melting in a pan she hadn't had time to turn off. The first light of day beginning to slip through the kitchen window, scattering pale golden streaks across the stainless steel counter. And a wooden spoon lying on the steel surface, still stained with passion fruit sauce, waiting for the cook to return. The cook would return, but not now. Right now, she was standing in the warm yellow pool of light from the prep counter, beside the man she didn't have to shrink herself to fit beside. And for the first time in her life, she didn't need to cook anything to feel that she deserved to be here. They married in September, at the Kincaid estate in Connecticut, a gray stone house by the sea that Rowan had visited twice for work, and both times she had stood at the window looking out at the ocean and quietly thought that this was the kind of house that had waited a very long time for someone to truly love it instead of merely owning it. The wedding wasn't large by the standards of Everett's world, but it was large enough for Rowan to look around the reception room and see that every person sitting there was someone she or Everett truly wanted present, not someone they needed to impress. And that difference was greater than any bouquet or suit. 6 months after the wedding, Rowan opened her own restaurant. She used the salary, bonuses, and all the capital she had quietly accumulated over the years, about $85,000, as her starting capital. The rest she borrowed from the bank, with a business plan she wrote herself. 42 pages. Every page filled with numbers she had calculated again and again, until she knew exactly how many meals served each night would allow the restaurant to break even, and how many would make it profitable. Everett offered to invest. She refused. He offered to lend her the money. She refused. Finally he asked, "Then how can I help?" And she said, "Use Kincaid Holdings to back my commercial credit line. Don't give me money. This restaurant has to stand on my feet, but I need your corporate weight to open the bank's doors." He looked at her with the expression she had learned to recognize as his way of saying, "I love you," without needing to use the words. Then he signed the guarantee papers. The restaurant was named Ashford, her mother's last name. Her name on the sign, in simple lettering, nothing ornate, because Rowan was not an ornate person. In its first year, Ashford was booked 3 months in advance, not because of advertising, not because of the Kincaid name behind it, but because Rowan cooked well, and at the end of every dinner, guests walked out the door feeling as though they had just eaten something prepared by someone who truly cared about what they were eating, and that feeling was rarer than people thought. She built a free cooking program for women 18 and older leaving the foster care system, girls like she had been at 16, with no family, no skills, no one telling them their hands could build something instead of only cleaning up what belonged to other people. The program began with 8 students. After 3 years, 47 had graduated, and 31 were working in the culinary industry, and every one of them knew how to fry an egg, because that was the first lesson Rowan taught, not because it was easy, but because she wanted them to know that the first meal you cook for yourself is the most important meal of your life. Their son Ashton was born in June of the year after the wedding, with his father's black hair and his mother's eyes. Everett said, "Look at everything as if they're deciding whether it can be trusted," which Rowan considered the greatest compliment any 4-month-old child had ever received. Their daughter Blythe arrived 24 months later with the strongest lungs the hospital had ever heard, a fierce stare, and an inborn ability to turn every bedtime negotiation into a negotiation she always won. Rowan occasionally heard news of how Grant's life had remained stagnant since that final phone call. Every time gossip reached her ears about his struggles in Rhode Island, she didn't feel joy or anger. She only felt a quiet distance. She reflected on it for an appropriate amount of time. Not too long, not too short. Long enough to respect the fact that she had once shared 5 years of her life with that man. Then her mind turned to the 22-year-old girl who had married him, the girl with no family searching for family, and she wanted to tell that girl one thing: you weren't wrong for wanting to belong somewhere. You were only wrong for thinking belonging meant disappearing. Then she dismissed the memory and continued living. 4 years after opening day, the anniversary night of Ashford, 8 o'clock in the evening, the dining room had closed. The lights had been dimmed, and only the soft glow of a few uncleared candles and the bar light still cast a warm yellow wash over the wooden ceiling. Rowan was wiping a table, not because she had to. The staff could do it. But wiping tables every night after closing was her ritual. She had wiped kitchen counters and dining tables every night since she was 22, and she would keep wiping them until she could no longer stand, because that was how she said goodbye to each day, and thanked it for giving her enough things to clean. Willa was in the back, washing the last stack of pots. 19 years old, a student from the 3rd class of the foster care program. 3 months in the profession. Her hands were still learning how to hold a pot properly, and tonight her hands had not finished learning, because a loud crash rang through the empty dining room when the copper pot slipped from Willa's hands and struck the floor. $200 lying on the tile. Willa froze. Her face went white. Her hands shook. Her eyes held the expression Rowan recognized immediately, because she had seen it in the mirror many times. The expression of someone waiting to be scolded, waiting to be criticized, waiting for someone to say she wasn't good enough to be here. Rowan didn't look up from the table she was wiping. "That copper pot cost $200, she said calmly, her voice neither rising nor falling. "Pick it up, wash it again. Next time, use both hands." Willa picked up the pot. Her hands were still trembling. Rowan stopped wiping. She looked at Willa. She looked at the 19-year-old girl standing in someone else's restaurant, holding the pot she was afraid she didn't deserve to hold. And Rowan saw herself, 11 years ago, trembling hands, standing in someone else's kitchen, wondering whether she was allowed to be there. "Do you know what the most expensive thing in this restaurant is?" Rowan asked. Willa shook her head. "The people standing in it. Pots can be replaced. People can't. Don't ever apologize for learning." Willa looked at her with wet eyes. She tried to hide by blinking quickly, and Rowan let her hide them because she knew that sometimes dignity lived in being allowed to cry without being asked why. The dining room door opened. Everett walked in, carrying 2 cartons of ice cream. 1 vanilla, 1 chocolate. 5-year-old Ashton walked beside his father, holding a blue plastic spoon, his steps solemn as though bringing ice cream to his mother, were the most important mission he had ever been given. Ashton insisted on bringing ice cream to his mother, Everett said. "I explained that Mom was working. I lost that negotiation." Ashton looked up at Rowan with his mother's gray-blue eyes and said, very seriously, "Mom has to eat ice cream." From outside the dining room door, 2-year-old Blythe sat in the stroller the nanny was holding, shouting into the room in a voice the whole neighborhood could hear. "Ice cream!" Ice cream! Ice cream! With the perfect three-syllable rhythm that only a 2-year-old completely certain of her rights could achieve. Rowan looked at her husband. The most powerful man on the East Coast was standing in her restaurant dining room at 8 o'clock at night, with ice cream on the sleeve of his suit and a 5-year-old child holding a plastic spoon beside him, with the stride of a guard on duty. She looked at Willa. The 19-year-old girl from the foster care system was holding a $200 copper pot and, for the first time in her life, had just been told, "Don't apologize for learning." She looked at the restaurant, her name on the sign, her recipes on the menu, the people she had trained standing in the kitchen. And she didn't need to step into the light. She had already been in the light for a long time, not the light someone had switched on for her, the light she had lit herself. From the fried egg that was a little too salty when she was 16, from 15 tries at the soufflé, from $340 in pawn shop money and a gray canvas backpack, from every 5 o'clock morning when she got up, even though no one asked whether she was tired, and she got up anyway. Rowan Kincaid, who had once stood in other people's kitchens, cooked food other people took credit for, and been told to stay invisible so someone else could shine, sat down at a table in the restaurant that carried her own name, took the blue plastic spoon from her son's hand, and ate ice cream. Rowan's story is not only a story of love, or revenge, or luck. It is a story about human worth, about how your worth does not depend on whether someone sees you, but on whether you see yourself. That belonging somewhere never means disappearing, that the strongest person in the room is not the one who speaks the loudest, but the one who still gets up at 5 o'clock in the morning when no one asks whether she is tired, and that sometimes the most important meal of your life is not the 7-course dinner served to powerful people, but the fried egg that is a little too salty, the one you cook for yourself at 16 in someone else's kitchen, alone, because no one else is cooking for you, and you decide that you deserve to eat. Thank you for listening until the very last moment. How did this story touch your heart? What do you think about Rowan's journey? Please share your feelings in the comments below. We always want to hear what you feel from deep within your heart. If this story meant something to you, please press the like button to support us. Press share to send it to someone you think needs to hear it, and press subscribe, then turn on notifications so you won't miss new stories every day. I wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.